I want to comment on a video by Daniel Greene called The Evolution of Character in Fantasy, because I think he has got a lot of things wrong. There is a link in the underbar for those who wish to see Daniel's video. You may want to watch it first, because I am only going to paraphrase him here. The first thing Daniel does is assert that when looking at classic fantasy characters, that there is often not a lot there, and that classic fantasy characters were about complete escapism, to the point where it's just an average strong guy with a sword who doesn't have much depth. No examples are given of such a story. The first problem here is, what does he mean by classic fantasy? What comes to my mind when I hear the term classic fantasy are books like T.H. White's The Once and Future King, or any other reworking of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, like The Mists of Avalon, or perhaps Abraham Merritt's The Moon Pool, or perhaps Kubla Khan, the Xanadu poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, or poems by Charles Baudelaire, or Peter Pan, or Alice in Wonderland, none of which would fit Daniel's description of just a strong guy running around with a sword. Of these old shallow characters, Daniel says they were just there to kick ass, kill some monsters, and get laid with the damsel in distress. And that doesn't sound like it's a criticism of Mary Poppins, does it? And unless I missed the part where Winnie the Pooh grabs a sword, kills a dragon in order to rescue the distressed piglet, and then has sex with him, or her, or it, whatever the hell Piglet is, does anyone know what Piglet's pronouns are? I don't think Daniel meant to criticize Winnie the Pooh, nor Gulliver's Travels, nor the Earthsea trilogy by Ursula K. Le Guin, nor Watership Down. Maybe a little bit of Peter Pan when he fights Captain Hook. And all those are books you'll find if you Google classic fantasy. This, I submit, is evidence that Daniel has a very impoverished view of classic fantasy. If the first thing that comes to your mind when I say classic fantasy is an almost naked barbarian with a sword fighting a monster, then you do not know what classic fantasy is, and you also have an impoverished view of fantasy yourself. The way Daniel is describing the flaws in the older characters makes me think his only remembered experience of older fantasy works is Robert E. Howard's Conan stories, and or Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter of Mars. Maybe the Gore novels by John Norman, but he also might be thinking of Beowulf or something I've never read or even heard of. It may be there are no stories Daniel can clearly remember because it's not the stories he is recalling, but the artwork on the book covers and in the comic books and in the gaming magazines and on heavy metal album covers and on Vans. Starting about the late 60s, there was an artist by the name of Frank Frazetta who did book covers and comics through to the 70s and 80s, and who became a millionaire for his work. Frazetta's subject matter and style caught on with other artists like Michael Whalen, Boris Vallejo, Rowena Morell, and even me. I was one of those artists. I worked for role-playing game companies like TSR, who invented Dungeons & Dragons, and later for Steve Jackson's games. On screen, you should be seeing one of my pen and ink illustrations, one I did for Steve Jackson's games. If I may digress for a moment, if there is anyone out there who bought any of my original art back in the 70s and 80s, I used to sell it at science fiction conventions all over the country, but mostly at WindyCon in Chicago and Capricon in the same city. I would appreciate being sent any photographs you have of the art. This might be a help to you if you want to sell my art online, because I can put it in a video and tell people where to buy it. If you want to sell it, there is always eBay and also a site called Heritage Comics, which I'll link in the underbar. Some of the people who resold my art there were Wendy and Richard Penny, the ElfQuest creators. My resale value isn't that great. It looks like you can get a few $100s for one of my pieces if that interests you. You may remember Wendy Penny from Capricon and WindyCon. She used to dress up in her Red Sonja costume. Enough about that. If you say you're interested in knowing more about the art I used to do back in the 70s and 80s, I'll do a proper video on that later. Now, back to Daniel Greene and his impoverished view of fantasy. Daniel claims that the old classic fantasy was boring and predictable. I disagree. Sure, some of it was. When publishers noticed that Frazetta and his imitators could sell a lot of books, they started churning out any sword and sorcery fantasy they could slap a good cover on. So you got a lot of Conan the Barbarian pastiche, like the ones written by Robert Jordan and L. Sprague de Camp. While I will defend Robert E. Howard's original stories, I won't be so kind to the imitators. Robert E. Howard wrote his first Conan stories before J.R.R. Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings. Conan the Barbarian was created by Howard in 1932. The Hobbit didn't come out until 1937. However, while publishers were scraping the bottom of the pulp barrel in the 80s for stories, they sometimes did discover little gems. For example, Elric of Melniboné by Michael Moorcock. If you looked at the cover of the first book, you might think it's just run-of-the-mill sword and sorcery. It's not. I guarantee you will not find it predictable. If you have any doubts, Daniel, and if you ever interview Brandon Sanderson again on your channel, just ask him about Elric of Melniboné. I know he has read it. When Daniel claims the only exception to these shallow characters is Boromir from Lord of the Rings, then I know he hasn't read Elric. For Elric is far more deep and tragic than Boromir. Elric doesn't rescue the damsel in distress. He kills his one true love because he has a vampiric sword called Stormbringer that sometimes controls him and takes everyone he loves away, but he'll die without it. Daniel says it took until the 80s for characters with depth to show up, to which I can only say, horseshit. There have always been deep characters in fantasy, and even today people publish novels with shallow characters. Depth is not what has been evolving and changing. Try Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or the picture of Dorian Gray if you have any doubts. If you really want to get a handle on how literature really evolves, I suggest reading T.H. White's The Once and Future King, written in 1958, then immediately follow it up by reading The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmerman Bradley, written in 1983. They are both books about King Arthur and Camelot, but Bradley focuses on the women of the Arthurian legend. Also, be aware that there may be depths to these characters you just don't respond to because you are growing up in the early 21st century, not the middle of the 20th century. For example, in White's book, King Arthur is an orphan, the product of infidelity at least, rape at worst. And there's an emphasis on a rather uniquely unromantic interpretation of Lancelot's adulterous affair with Guinevere. White's book was published in 1958, and World War II ended in 1945. And that war produced its share of orphans, rapes, and sexual infidelity of soldiers' wives back home. Those were kids who were in 1958 ready to start reading fantasy. When you know about these things, you'll also be able to see how later writers used them to add tidbits of character depth to their stories. For example, remember the scene in X-Men where Magneto is in prison reading White's book? Magneto himself is a war orphan with rather kingly ambitions, putting together his own kind of Camelot, and he's reading about an orphan boy who becomes king. This goes the other way also, where old farts like me don't easily relate to modern concerns. Daniel notes there are more representations of mental illness in modern fantasy, and that might be because there is simply more mental illness in the modern world. According to an article in Psychology Today called Are Mental Health Issues on the Rise? There's a link in the underbar. We are seeing a rise in certain types of mental illness. Another Psychology Today article, The Decline of Play and the Rise of Children's Mental Disorders, offers some reasons. For me, the idea of reading about a character with depression just sounds, well, depressing. It's not something I read fantasy for. Daniel also mentions nihilism, saying that the discussion of nihilism in fantasy has only recently come about. I don't think that pulp writers like H.P. Lovecraft or Clark Ashton Smith were on Daniel's mind when he said that. Lovecraft is probably the most nihilistic writer I have ever read, more so than Kafka or Camus. And both Lovecraft and Smith wrote for the pulp magazine Weird Tales back in the 1920s and 30s. Yet another contradiction to Daniel's claim that the old pulps were just good versus evil and barbarians with swords. If anyone out there knows of a modern writer who is actually more nihilistic than Lovecraft, please tell me about them in the comments section. I suppose someone out there might mention Thomas Ligotti or Clive Barker. Others might mention Stephen King. King is not a nihilist. At least he wasn't when he wrote The Stand. Excuse me if I spoil the ending for those who haven't read The Stand, but the climax of the book has the literal hand of God come down out of the sky to blow up all the evil people who congregated in Las Vegas. Nihilists do not include the Christian God in their fiction. Barker's stories also on occasion explore religious concepts. Ligotti, Barker, and King are just occasional borrowers of Lovecraftian concepts. Only Ligotti fully embraces those concepts. Now, before I roast Daniel too much, I must confess I have not yet read a lot of fantasy published after 2001. I used to devour every fantasy and science fiction story I could find at the library when I was younger, but that ended for me in the 1990s, and I am only now starting to read recently published fantasy again. That's why I started listening to Daniel's videos, to learn what has become popular in fantasy while I was away. Now I've got books by Brandon Sanderson and Patrick Rothfuss on my to-be-read list. Also, in Daniel's defense, he's not alone in this oversimplistic idea about the evolution of fantasy. I saw a video on YouTube called The Evolution of Modern Fantasy, a convention panel at the 2017 Emerald City Comic-Con, where professional published writers thought almost everything before they were published was too heavily influenced by Tolkien, with a default medieval setting of knights and kings. No. What they had chosen to read before they were published was Tolkien-inspired fantasy. They could have read Nightwings by Robert Silverberg, published in 1969, or Ray Bradbury's October Country, or Bridge of Birds by Barry Hughart. There has always been plenty of fantasy that was not medieval. Daniel is no doubt right about fantasy evolving, but he's probably wrong about what has been evolving and why. I doubt if character depth has evolved that much, but it's possible that character relatability has changed. Our culture has gone through profound changes since I started reading fiction, and modern fiction no doubt reflects that change even when it takes place in a fantasy world. I really enjoyed the Conan stories when I read them in high school, but I suspect modern readers would find Conan too toxically masculine. Daniel noted some causes of change in our culture, the loss of the Vietnam War and 9/11, but I want to end this video by suggesting another cause of change, the death of Christianity in the West. Consider the most successful fantasy writers before the 80s were three devout Christians: Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and George MacDonald. MacDonald was a Christian minister who also wrote Christian apologetics books. Tolkien was a lifelong Catholic, and Lewis's faith profoundly affected his work, and he, like MacDonald, wrote Christian apologetics books. Today we have fantasy writers like Sir Philip Pullman and George R.R. Martin. Pullman is an outspoken atheist, and Martin has called himself a lapsed Catholic, and he has said, "You would consider me an atheist or agnostic." This isn't me just cherry-picking writers to support my view. The Pew Research Foundation has been documenting the decline of religion in our culture, and you can find many articles on the subject. You tell me, dear readers, how do you think that cultural shift has affected fantasy?